All right, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there today. Long COVID, brain foggy day. So I just want to finish the lecture on advocacy, go through political parties, local government, and then I'll review questions or review the exam study guide. So, last time we ended by talking about Hannah Arendt and some of her writing, some of her ideas about freedom, about evil, and all of these various things. Now, going on to kind of talk about democracy itself. So there's something we might call the folk theory of democracy. The idea here is that as long as governments are doing what public opinion wants, or signals they want, then the government is functioning. So democratic, even if they're trampling on the rights of someone else or something like this, according to the functional aspect of the democracy itself, it is working. However, there are Aiken and Bartels here basically argue that elections don't always produce responsive government to public opinion. They may be responsive to other organization, other special interests, and so on. Kind of some of the key work on public opinion as well as propaganda, perhaps even more so propaganda, was the journalist Walter Lippmann looking at the First World War. And there's a video about him in the module I'm setting up with, kind of supplemental materials. And it talks about what he was doing. He was looking at World War One and looking at all these discrepancies from military reports, government documents, and the press, and kind of looking at how governments were shaping public opinion through propaganda. So in the 1930s, people start to become interested in this response. I should say Lippmann published that book in like 1920 or something, and it had a huge impact. And a lot of democratic governments realized that they need to, kind of rather than controlling and just directing the public, they wanted to see what the public wanted and see if they could respond to it. Or respond to these wants. So Gallup and Pew Research Center were set up as two of these survey agencies. I watched a presentation by the director of the U.S. Census Bureau. He was director from 2012 to 2018. I saw him a few years ago. And he oversaw the 2010 census, which was, the big national one that happens every 10 years. And he was talking about surveys and the low response rates. Pew Research Center, one of the largest, most well-known research centers, polling agencies in the U.S. Its response rate is only 7%. So a very, very small response rate. The same goes for teaching evaluations. Very, very low response rates, especially since they moved to digital, not having to fill them out in class and so on. So that's something to think about, especially if you're into research methods and so on. That people are filling out surveys less and less. I think because they're getting bombarded with more and more of them. A classic article or research study was done by a couple guys named Page and Shapiro back in the early 80s called Effects of Opinion on Policy. They looked at a number of survey questions that, examined or asked about policy preferences. They found about 3,000 of them, and they focused on about 350 issues. And they, looked at how the public had responded, and they wanted to know if policy had followed. And back in the 1980s, at the time of this study, they said yes in this article. they moved in the same direction 2/3 of the time. Public opinion, I mean, policy moved in the same direction as public opinion 2/3 of the time. So, what do we think now? Almost 40 years later or so. Shapiro says yes. He says overall, it seems like it looks like democracy is working. Policies are following public opinion. Page and another researcher, they did another analysis, and they said our analysis suggests that majorities of the American public actually have little influence over government policy. So that's kind of interesting. You have the two original authors who, have come to different conclusions about their own research, decades ago. So it's very messy, as the article suggests. It's very hard to tell how public opinion influences public policies, and in what ways it does, especially as there are different elections fairly rapidly. Policy development tends to be very, very complex, so it's perhaps not too surprising that a lot of Americans, don't really have much to say about policy, but may have more to say about issues. So, climate change, or abortion, or gun rights, or whatever it might be. People might know broadly how they feel about these issues, but people may not know everything about gun regulations, what guns are regulated, and what states to what degree, and so on and so forth. So it's not too surprising that people don't necessarily know that. And that's basically looking at answering that question. Why is it so hard to figure out whether policy follows public opinion? Well, it's just very difficult to measure these things in one regard. In another, like I said, most of us don't really know the deep policy issues at work. Again, we may know our issues, but we don't know the policies around them. So, advocacy organizations. So, a lot of social scientists and journalists generally believe that interest groups are the more effective type of advocacy organization, the other one being social movements. So in this class, the people who are doing the government stuff, they're going to be looking at local policy development and federal policies and so on. The private nonprofits and business groups are going to be essentially looking at advocacy, and probably interest group rather than social movement organizations. So it's interesting because there's this general perception that interest groups have a lot of sway on public policy, and that social movements do as well. However, research finds that they often don't. That interest groups, lobbying doesn't always, pay off, so to speak. That protest movements, they may have some effect on policy, but maybe not a lot. Even after, the George Floyd beating, killing, in the protests afterward, there have not been enormous changes to public policy. There's been some changes to policing, but really not a whole lot. And even despite all the protests and the support by most of the population as well. So Weber points out that political parties can really only develop under rational legal systems. They can't under the other two types of authority: traditional, which are essentially monarchies, aristocracies, and then charismatic authority, which would be a one party state, which isn't really a political party system, and maybe a dictator, that kind of thing. I'll talk about this in just a moment, that as well. All right, let me pull up the other slides. Okay. So we have several political parties in the United States. We have the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, the Independence Party. There is a Socialist Party, among and there is a Communist Party, and among several others. And also the Radical Birthday Party, which they want to stage an insurrection and give everyone cake and presents. Sounds pretty good, actually. Okay, so back to Weber. He said basically when we look at societies, power is divided among three groups. You've got status groups, which are everything, prestige of a person's position, certain privileges that people are born with, gender, minority status, all these different various things. Interestingly, the word the state derives from status. That's sort of the etymology of the state. Kind of interesting. Class, so socioeconomic class, tied to a person's occupation, oftentimes their geographic location, and so on. And then the political party, or he just called it parties, and this was, political groupings and the political parties that were becoming more and more popular during Weber's time, where countries were adopting the political party system. The oldest political party that's still in existence is the British Tory Party. They've sort of adapted to change over time and kind of kind of put their arm around various policies and oh yes, this is what we do. And but right now Britain's in crisis, and so the Tories may be as well. Another classic study that built off of Weber was Robert Michael's examination of organizations, looking at political organizations, parties, governments, but also corporations and things like that, and basically noticing this trend in which over time, power tends to concentrate, becomes more oligarchic, and it's more centralized. Fewer people are making the decisions, that kind of thing. Another classic work, kind of in the beginnings of sociology of politics. Seymour Martin Lipset wrote The Political Man, surveyed a range of democratic countries around the world, and said that yes, there seems to be this basic spectrum that official parties as well as extremist groups fall into: the left and the right and the center. He said that basically political parties, they follow public opinion. So that's, we're going to return to that in a moment. So his key point is that inequities in society tend to bring about the most harm, and they're likely to result in, or more likely to result in extremist activity. So you kind of look at those earlier studies of the sociology of political parties, and they argue that party politics are really determined by these cleavages in society, these gaps between social class, different races, different religions, and so on. And this really determines what political parties tend to be about. Another major figure in the early studies of political parties was Paul Lazarsfeld. Also very influential, still is very influential, probably too influential in my view, and that's what's called the political choice theory. And this kind of has dominated the study of voting. So one of the main arguments that it has is that people can vote with their feet. If they feel they're not being represented, their legislators aren't doing what they want, or the neighborhood, the state, whatever it might be, and they can just move somewhere else. Another argument was that, again, political parties are more of a reflection of social attitudes. The public's choices are what drove political parties. Now, it relied heavily on what we call rational choice theory. And broadly, that's this idea that kind of developed in economics and political science and was used by a lot of early sociology. And this idea that people calculate essentially cost-benefit analyses and use, logical thinking when making decisions. Well, some problems with that. Most people, I would say, can't really vote with their feet. They can't really just move somewhere if they don't like how things are. They have to find a job, somewhere to live. If they're a homeowner, they have to sell their home. If they're not, then they have to cruise the rental market or whatever. In other words, it's actually even becoming less easy for a lot of people to vote with their feet. When they wrote this too, it was even less less easy for people to move with their feet because a lot of places were actually segregated, legally segregated. And then the other one is, just the theory that underpins public choice theory, and deeper theory about human psychology and thought and so on, and that's again the rational choice theory, and it's been mostly discredited in psychology, sociology, and the new field of behavioral economics, or what's called decision-making analysis. It essentially takes, it's the application of psychology to behavioral economics and certain types of sociology as well. So the article I had you read kind of emphasized this position called political articulation, basically saying that parties don't really just follow public opinion, nor do they necessarily drive public opinion, but they kind of work in a back and forth way with public opinion. Political parties basically exist by stitching different coalitions together and kind of emphasizing certain social identities and certain political, religious, spiritual, whatever it might be, interests. So, kind of building off of the famous Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci, who wrote these famous kind of anti-fascist works called the Prison Notebooks while he was, you go figure, in prison. He basically said the masses don't exist politically if they're not framed in political parties. And that's kind of an important point. He's thinking about like the French Revolution and things like that, where there weren't any political parties, so it was essentially sort of mob violence, and it kind of fell apart, and could be easily taken over by Napoleon, and then you have the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy and so on. Whereas, if you have different political parties, then, you have the masses being at least represented, and, they can have more of an influence. Gramsci is popular for the term hegemony, which refers to a dominant idea or system of power. You often hear of, say, like hegemonic masculinity or American global hegemony, and all of these terms, refer to dominant ideas and, again, systems of power. So liberal democracy, capitalism, so on. There are many things that are sort of hegemonic. So the authors emphasize these two different approaches to political parties, saying political parties as traditional parties that are that can be left and right, but they generally try not to revolutionize the status quo, upend the political order or the international order. And then integral parties, which basically kind of, they essentially focus on those social cleavages, or certain social cleavages, and kind of ignore others and try to transform the social order based upon certain social cleavages. So certain, class interests or ethnic interests and so on and so forth. So right now, I think what's kind of interesting is that when we look at most of, say, Western Europe, but also a lot of Eastern Europe, places where we have liberal democracies right now. The I'm sorry, I got this wrong here. So most traditional parties are actually kind of centrist, and it's most integral parties that are currently right wing. So in Europe, for example, the kind of dominant social democracy, kind of left of center groups have been losing power over the last 10, 15 years. And a lot of integral parties are on the rise, so like the AfD in Germany, which is kind of a far right party. You have the National Front in France, which is again a nationalist right wing political party. The current government in Italy is a far right wing, actually came out of neo-fascist roots and so on. Excuse me. So you could say that in the United States, the two-party system is so powerful that it, kind of maintains the status quo, despite, a lot of the Republican Party kind of taking on sort of the aspects of what we or the behaviors and so on that we generally associate with integral parties, and which may lead to some interesting politics in the years ahead. More interesting, I should say. So one of the things that many of these political approaches don't do a good job at explaining is why certain social cleavages become more sort of salient, come to the forefront at certain times in history and not others. And why do some social cleavages become politically salient while others are not so, are fairly marginal? So they use the example, which is a good example, of Hindu nationalism. So right now in India, there's been a rise in Hindu nationalists with the BJP party, the political party, which is a right-wing Hindu nationalist party, bordering on sort of fascism, as some of those characteristics of it. And so Hinduism, and it's very anti-Islam, and there's about 200 million Muslims in India, the largest in any non-Muslim majority country, and they're increasingly facing, a lot of discrimination and kind of more hate crimes and some of this. And so it's actually gone to the point where just in the last few days, if you follow some of the news or something, so Narendra Modi is the Prime Minister of India right now, and back in about 20 years ago, he was the governor of the province of Gujarat in India. And there was a riot and a bunch of ethnic violence, a bunch of killings, around 2,000 people killed or so, all Muslims. It was basically an ethnic cleansing of Muslims in various parts of Gujarat. And Modi either took part in it, maybe directed some of it, or at the very least he did nothing about it, and it was actually sanctioned by the United States and until he became the prime minister, and then we welcomed him with this like extravagant show and so on back in around 2012ish or so when he was elected. Now, just a few days ago, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, made a documentary of him, and it's critical of Modi, and it's banned in India, and it's such an extent that they've pressured YouTube and various other organizations not to show it. They've banned actually VPN from somehow accessing it, which I'm not quite sure how they're doing that, but Modi does not want the people of India to see this documentary, so that's very interesting. makes me want to watch it. It's right now it's only available in the UK. I'm trying to figure out some way to make it available legally so that I can play it in a class next quarter. So anyway, that's one of the things that political articulation perspective can do, because it kind of looks at how these different identities are stitched together, and how they make up political parties. And so that can help us understand why now. Hindus and Muslims have lived together, with various degrees of peace and hostility and whatever for 1,000 years or so. Why is it that, or in even the last 50 years, why is it now that we see this Hindu nationalism on the rise, and this growing vitriol and hatred and so on being directed at the Muslim community in India? What's going on now? The political articulation approach would say, okay, there's changes happening in the world that seems to be driving a lot of this, kind of right-wing activity, more nationalistic attitudes, nationalistic parties, and so on. That might be what's going on in India at the moment. The other thing that political articulation approaches really emphasize is the intermediary role, and that's of knowledge and expertise, the role of experts and intellectuals and so on within a party, and how they can help direct, the path that a party takes, and so on. So this expert class can then help organizations, figure out how to go through things. In my own research, I, kind of emphasize the role of technical expertise and how experts are needed for urban development to help policymakers. And to help private developers, actually, because it, kind of focused on what I call the gaps of knowledge between market actors and government actors, and how they don't really know how, one doesn't know how the other acts, and that's kind of a problem. So anyway, that's the political articulation approach, excuse me, at least, emphasizes this. So this is coming directly from the conclusion of the Lotesta and De Leon article. So they looked at these three strands of research that have developed. They looked at how the literature on how parties form just has not been that great, just by kind of saying it either follows public opinion or it drives public opinion. It's a bit of both. And then they also look at how, political coalitions and, expertise and knowledge, how these things come together to drive political parties. And then in the last part of their article, they kind of look at, okay, well, what's going on with the recent rise of ethnic nationalism, looking at the rise of Hinduism, but also they looked at, Donald Trump and the rise of I should say ethnic nationalism, not ethic. Jeez. Okay, this is what happens when you have long COVID sometimes. Okay, so anyway, ethnic nationalism, they looked at it in the U.S. as well. So I think it's a stronger approach than what we see in political sociology usually. As I said, the political parties were sort of dropped from the analysis and kind of taken over by political scientists, and so I think this is a good way to kind of bring political parties back into the sociological, back under the sociological microscope, I should say. Now, local government. Well, one of the biggest things facing local governments right now is how do you manage affordable housing and a good economy. It's a big challenge, as we know here in California, but especially coastal California, from the Bay Area. Los Angeles is not incredibly, less affordable either. In some ways, Los Angeles is less affordable because you have lower wages in the region. It's not always factored into, some measures of affordability. But kind of one of the main measures, at least, kind of looks at that relationship between the median income of an area and what it would be required to qualify for a mortgage. And, a lot of places it shows a pretty bad, pretty low relationship. It's becoming increasingly difficult to qualify for a mortgage, especially if people have student loans or, health loans, credit card debt, all of this stuff. I should say healthcare debt, and so on. So, homeowners play a big role in local politics. Kind of a famous and very important work in this area with this study or this kind of hypothesis, but very well developed hypothesis, basically looking at home voters. Basically, looking at homeowners who vote. The main argument being that local governments essentially do what a lot of homeowners want. It's usually homeowners that are at, city council meetings. If you ever go to one, there's not a lot of attendance unless it's some really hot button issue that's being discussed. And even then, it doesn't always, there's still not a lot of people who show up. So what happens then is that homeowners, they're more likely to vote, they're more likely to take part in local politics, go to city councils, join local political parties, etc., etc. And so they'll also tend to, one of the things that they want to do is maintain or raise their own property values of their own homes. And so generally what you see here, and I looked at this and saw this quite a bit in my own research, of developers and cities who want to build apartment complexes, affordable and standard market rate, whatever, and we'll often find that they'll be prevented from doing that or restricted due to homeowners and homeowner coalitions and stuff like this, who will pressure cities to pass zoning and land use policies that prevent certain types of development from happening. And yeah, I saw this all around, here in Santa Barbara and down to Thousand Oaks and up around Portland and so on, where people didn't want affordable housing. Why not? Well, they believe, rightly or wrongly, that it will lower their property values of their house, and the house has become sort of a vehicle for wealth creation in the United States and increasingly elsewhere. It's a fascinating way in which to understand American politics in particular, and the way in which suburbs, which are a bunch of generally houses that are owned by individuals, how that shaped so much policy in America and so on over the last 50 years, developed a sort of a not that realistic picture of American society. Kind of showed the suburbs and so on. Great book on sort of that era, the 1950s. Forgetting the author's name, but it's called "The Way We Never Were," and kind of smashes the myths that kind of pervade our culture of what the 1950s were like. Even for white people, they were not as were not as great as is typically shown or believed. Now, as I said, housing is becoming more important for local politics, and it's important, I think, to notice some of these things that have changed in regards to housing. When you look at the size of houses back in the 1940s and 1950s, roughly 1,000 square feet, 210 million BTUs of energy would be used. Then you go to 2010, essentially, it's gone, the average square feet is, roughly around 2,500. And, the mortgage payments have gone up. Now, what I think is particularly interesting here is the average size of the household in 1950 was, roughly 3 to 4 kids. Today, it's, 2 to 3. Yet the size of the house has, almost doubled, or, more than doubled. So kind of incredible, shows really kind of a waste of space, actually. And we may see in the future some of these houses will house some of the elderly and so on. It's another thing I wanted to mention, that to tie to into that discussion of the elderly last week. A lot of the elderly, or not a lot, growing numbers of elderly are homeowners. And so, they are going to vote according to their home values, because they want to have high home values so that they can get into a, nicer nursing home, or, pay off their kids to take care of them, or, whatever it might be. So again, just looking at the cost of the single-family home, 60,000. You look at 30 years later, it's 220,000 or so. So the price of homes are going up, and it's becoming kind of a crisis for a lot of people in the working class, the middle class, and so on. This also describes a lot of the differences in wealth between black people and white people in America. If you look at income, you look at, say, the incomes between whites and blacks, and there's a gap between them, but it's not a huge gap, and it's doesn't rise necessarily a whole lot for white people over time. Wealth is different, though. You see that, in the 1960s, there was a $50,000 wealth gap between white and black households. In the 2010s, roughly today too, you see that there's a $100,000 wealth gap between, more than that, or roughly 130,000 or so wealth gap between whites and blacks. That's just incredible. So what's been going on here since the 1960s that has led to this huge wealth difference? Well, the main thing is not necessarily differences in income, it's actually differences in home ownership. And why is that? Well, the suburbs. Okay, well, why is that? Why would that play a role? Well, white people moved into the suburbs, and a lot of black people didn't. And why is that? Government loans that were restricted to black people. So after the Second World War, the government wanted people to move to the suburbs, and generally governments all around were fairly pretty racist, and they wanted it to be mostly white people. So the white people started moving from the inner cities to take advantage of these loans. You had some white flight going on, where white people are moving because black people are moving into the inner cities as part of the Great Migration out of the South. But, a lot of white people, kind of like the public choice theory problems, a lot of white people at that time didn't have the money to just pick up and go move into the suburbs, get a big house out there. So, they relied upon those loans. So a lot of white people benefited from the loans. They started buying houses. Housing becomes this vehicle of investment. So that white people gain more wealth. Maybe their kids inherit the house or the property, and they sell it or whatever. And pretty soon you have all this wealth that is held by more white people than black people, because of kind of a path-dependent relationship from these loans that were either given out to people, or given to white people, I should say, and not given to black people. Very interesting. Then there's, redlining, and just kind of the ways in which zoning worked against black people and so on. But just the loans themselves are a hugely unknown factor in some of these differences in terms of race and wealth. So we generally have, city governments and county governments, and then state governments. There are some regional governments in the United States. Now, what are regional governments? They're not, government may not even be the right word, but they're essentially organizations that try to kind of manage transportation and infrastructure planning across a few different counties and cities. Portland, Oregon's regional government is called the Metro. They're kind of interesting because they have, they're the only government, at least they were the only government a few years ago, and I believe they still are, that's elected, the only elected regional government in the country. And so you see here, and this is a map of the Portland area and the different districts of the Metro Council, and people vote for them. And I interviewed a couple of current council members and former council members when I was doing research up there, because I was actually primarily interested in what was going on in the suburbs. A lot of people focus on the inner city, and there's a million research articles about that, but comparatively much fewer on kind of the suburban area. Now, going to go to the study guide and just go over a few terms. It's not going to be a comprehensive review. Go rather quickly, but just to kind of make sure that I do kind of go over some of this. Okay, so these are concepts you should be aware of. Most of the questions are going to be definitions, but there might be a few that kind of focus on theory. So authoritarian personality, so remember, think about the history of it. It was developed after the Second World War by Theodor Adorno. Key thing about it, it was this first kind of study of authoritarianism, and it developed that thing called the F scale, the fascism scale. Then a guy up in the University of Manitoba, who developed the right-wing authoritarian scale, RWA. So think about what comprises it. It's kind of measures conventionalism, aggression, and so on. There's those three components that it has. And then kind of think about some of the problems with that line of research, which are on those first slides. And the first reading, which discusses the securitarian personality, it kind of points out some of the problems with the RWA scale. It looks at the child trait scale, and so kind of make sure you're familiar with that as well. Basically everything from that lecture, make sure you're aware of. Public-private organizations, you should be well versed on that. Advocacy, how does advocacy work? Is it effective? There'll be questions about that. The social security, basically know that it was developed during the Great Depression as a way in which to take care of the elderly. And so make sure that we pay taxes into it, and it funds the elderly right now who are retired. And the idea is that when we retire, it'll be funded by the younger generation. So challenges to it are that it's people are living longer. And there's fewer, families are getting smaller, so there's not going to be as many young people. So there's kind of a question of where's the funding going to come from. Positive and negative liberty, I'm not going to have any trick questions about that. Positive liberty, the freedom to do something. Negative freedom, when you're restricted from doing something. And the examples, there will be some examples, but they're going to be pretty straightforward again. Freedom to do something, the restrictions on your ability to do something. Isaiah Berlin, he also had the idea of value pluralism. That's this notion that no matter what, there are always going to be different values that people have, and you're never going to quite come to absolute consensus, across humanity, or however you want to measure it. Then remember John Rawls. He came up with that experiment, the veil of ignorance, where you're thrown into the world randomly, and basically the idea is how would you design a society behind this veil of ignorance. Now, he has this idea called the difference principle that would justify inequalities as long as those inequalities work to the betterment of those less well off. So maybe people are extremely wealthy, but they're taxed, and their taxes help out the lowest in society, or they donate to charities that help the lowest in society, and so on. Think about political parties, what I just talked about, libertarianism, the idea of reducing or removing interference of government. Think about Friedrich Hayek, his ideas about spontaneity and markets in the economy, and so on. Utilitarianism, what's best for society, what's best for the maximum number. So I'm not going to go into these right now, sort of losing my voice and losing my ability to do this, but go to the Mann article. I mean, he has these pretty laid out pretty clearly, the four different types of power that the two different types of power he discusses: infrastructural power and despotic power, and then the four types of tasks for any society, according to Mann, which that's kind of interesting. Think about public opinion, propaganda, policy outcomes, polling, social cleavages, that stuff we all talked about today, political articulation. Then the moral foundations, just there might be a few questions on those, just kind of basic definitional questions. Same thing with Weber's three types of authority. So remember, this will be done on Canvas, online, on Wednesday. At your leisure. It'll be an hour and 15 minutes, unless you have accommodations. And once you start, the hourglass is turned over. You can't, just go off and do something else and come back. You have to, you have to keep on taking the exam. So make sure that, you're ready for it, that you have your books positioned and notes positioned in a way that they're easily accessible, and so on. To access the exam, you will go to quizzes, click on there, it'll show up. I'll send an email about that as well. All right, everyone. Well, I wish you the best of luck on the exam, and I will see you on Monday, unless you come to my office hours. I'll have office hours from noon to 2, and then I'll actually be around from 3 to 4 as well. All right. Well, best of luck on the exam, everyone.